I'm Will Pyle, and happy to be introducing our visiting speaker, Martin Dimitrov, who's visiting us today from the government department at Dartmouth College. Martin joined the government department several years ago after getting his doctorate degree at Stanford University from the political science department there, where he completed a dissertation entitled Administrative Decentralization, Legal Fragmentation, and the Rule of Law, the Enforcement of Intellectual Property Rights Laws in China, Russia, Taiwan, and the Czech Republic. Now, he has a book based on that dissertation research. Actually, it's going to focus mainly on China, from what I understand, and that'll be coming out from Cambridge University Press next year. And Martin's also at work on another book manuscript which compares communist regimes and assesses why some collapsed, whereas others were relatively resilient. Martin's a native of Bulgaria and speaks a number of languages, including, and this makes me particularly jealous, both Russian and Mandarin Chinese fluently. And he's an alum, actually, of our summer language programs, both the Chinese program and the French program. So please join me in welcoming Martin back to Middlebury. It's been about 10 years since he was here, for his talk entitled The Politics of Piracy in China and Russia.
Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Professor Pyle, for the generous introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be back here. As Professor Pyle mentioned to you, I was here 2 summers in a row, in '96 and '97, and I did first the French school and then the Chinese school. And I had a great time at Middlebury. I had never been here in another season apart from the summer, and I have to say this campus is beautiful year-round, and I'm very happy to be back. And I'm very happy to have this opportunity to present a portion of my research, which will be published, as Professor Pyle mentioned to you, next year as a book entitled The Politics of Piracy in China. So what I'm going to talk about today is a topic that is in the news. You can read in both newspapers and magazines about piracy. Piracy is a big problem. The U.S. Copyright and trademark and patent industries are losing billions of dollars each year in China as a result of the piracy of software, books, music, trademarks, and patents. So what I'm going to talk about today is first this was not supposed to happen. Okay. So first I'm going to define this concept of intellectual property rights. And then I will talk about how those intellectual property rights are protected in 2 countries, in, first of all, China, and then in Russia. Why China and Russia? Because both China and Russia have very high piracy rates, yet the ways in which the relevant laws that protect intellectual property are enforced are quite different. And it's important to understand how intellectual property rights laws are enforced for various reasons. An understanding of intellectual property rights has implications for our understanding of the emergence of the rule of law in transitional economies. It has some implications for our understanding of property rights. I know that a bunch of you in this room are in Professor Pyle's seminar where you're comparing transitional economies. How do you establish property rights in transitional economies is a big puzzle. And finally, this topic is important because of some recommendations for U.S. Foreign policy towards both China and Russia. So, first of all, not all of you are familiar with this concept of intellectual property rights, so I want to spend some time telling you about what intellectual property rights are, and then I will talk about their enforcement in China. So there are 3 types of intellectual property rights. The first one is copyrights, and as college students, this is something which is extremely familiar to you. So what does copyright protect? It protects literary and artistic works, so things like books, music, videos, and also very importantly, it protects computer software. And in China, all of those things, books, music, videos, and computer software, are frequently pirated. Why? Because the price of legitimate goods is sometimes 100 times more expensive than the price of a knockoff or of a pirated copy. And there's a lot of money to be made for those entrepreneurial individuals who go ahead and produce pirated versions of, let's say, Microsoft Windows. So the first kind of intellectual property rights is copyrights. The second one is trademarks. Here you see an officer from an important government bureaucracy in China who is checking out bags in a fancy store in Shanghai. And he's checking out those bags because trademarks are basically brand names. So the moment that you put a Gucci or Prada or Fendi label on a bag that costs $5 or $10 to produce, you can sell it for $1,000 or $2,000. So here again, if you're an entrepreneurial individual, there's a lot of money to be made because there's a huge price differential. It takes $5 to produce, you can sell it for $2,000. So if you can produce an acceptable knockoff copy, maybe you can get 50 for it, and you pocket the difference between the production costs and the retail costs. So trademarks are frequently counterfeited in China. Counterfeiters get inventive, and they want to explore new market niches. So here you have, obviously, a chocolate bar, which was produced around 2003 when there was the SARS crisis. People felt Mars, SARS sounds similar, and they wanted to capitalize on this novelty. The third kind of intellectual property rights are patents. And patents protect new, useful, and non-obvious inventions. Here, obviously, we have the little blue pills that protect the erectile dysfunction drug Viagra. And Viagra is a great drug. It works on humans and on pandas. Pandas are an endangered species in China, and here you have a panda, which is a baby panda, which is being artificially fed, and eventually Viagra can be used to help with reproduction. In China, the market for fake Viagra is huge because there again, the legitimate drug costs about $10. The knockoff could be a couple of bucks, retail value, and probably only 20 or 30 cents to produce. So those are the three main subtypes of intellectual property rights: copyrights, trademarks, and patents. And if we're interested in how one can go about protecting them, because all of them are subject to widespread and frequent counterfeiting, there are four main options. The first one is intuitively what all of us think about when we think of violations of laws or infringement of rights. How would you go about and protect them? Well, you go to court. So the first option is this judicial protection, which is can be realized by going to a civil court of law. The second one is protection through customs. So customs can stop goods from either being imported into a country or from being exported out of a country. The third option is administrative enforcement, and this is the one which is not particularly intuitive because in this country there are not that many administrative agencies which can be used to go out and enforce laws and regulations. But in countries that have been communist countries for a long period of time, administrative enforcement is quite pervasive. So in China, there's a whole range of different government agencies which can go out and they can enforce laws and regulations even though they're not courts of law. So they don't have judges in them, they have just administrative officials, and those administrative officials can go out and enforce the relevant laws and regulations. The fourth option is criminal enforcement. So what this means is you just go to the police and you tell them, hey guys, infringing intellectual property rights is a crime, and it's a crime in pretty much all countries. It's punishable by imprisonment for up to 5 years or 6 years, depending on the jurisdiction. And you should go out and catch those criminals who are producing fake Fendi bags, and they're destroying our brand. So those are the 4 options. And what is interesting to me when I was doing the research for my dissertation and my book is the tremendous variation that we have across countries in terms of which method of enforcement is the dominant and the preferred method of enforcement. So here is a table that is hard to read, but I want you to focus on the top 2 lines, on the lines where we have the data for China and Russia. So China and Russia are similar in many ways. They're both huge countries, huge in terms of territory. They're also countries with very high piracy rates. However, they differ, and they differ in terms of how those intellectual property rights laws are enforced. What we have in China is a huge amount of administrative enforcement. So I will talk in greater detail about the various kinds of administrative agencies that enforce intellectual property rights laws, but there is a lot of them, and they're doing a lot of work. What we don't have in China is criminal and civil enforcement. By the way, can you see the table? Am I obscuring it? Okay. So what is interesting here about China is, first of all, why is there so little civil enforcement through the courts of law and so little criminal enforcement? And second, why is there so much administrative enforcement? And Russia, by contrast, it looks like nothing much is happening in China. So, in Russia. In Russia, administrative enforcement is low, civil court enforcement is low, and criminal enforcement is significantly higher than it is in China. So the Russia puzzle is, why is it that criminal enforcement is so much higher than, for example, civil court enforcement, and why is it that it's so much higher than criminal enforcement in China? So those questions, even though they look detailed, perhaps not all that exciting, idiosyncratic, are actually very important. So the argument that I'm going to make is that it makes a huge difference whether laws are enforced through administrative agencies or whether they're enforced through courts of law and through the police. And basically the argument is that if you have a lot of administrative enforcement, you're going to have undesirable enforcement. You're going to have problematic enforcement that doesn't subscribe to the principles of the rule of law. And if you have court enforcement, if you have criminal enforcement, then this kind of enforcement is more likely to be the desirable kind of enforcement, the enforcement that comes closer to our understanding of the rule of law. So a lot of enforcement is not necessarily a good thing. All right, so if you were to imagine a typical owner of an intellectual property right, let's say a company that possesses trademarks, and let's say that this is Gucci, operating in China. They obviously are producing very expensive leather bags and shoes and other items where you have huge price differentials between the knockoff copy and the legitimate copy, and items which are subject to frequent counterfeiting. So you have Gucci in China. And Gucci has found out that the market is flooded by counterfeits. So it's wondering what to do. Well, it has 2 options. The first option is this option of going for enforcement either through a civil court of law or approaching the police. So both kinds of enforcement are similar in a sense because they're subject to very clear rules about what should be done. And then in addition to this enforcement through the civil courts of law and the police, it has another option. And this option is the administrative enforcement option. And actually what we observe in China is that there's a huge range of administrative agencies, and all of them have the right to enforce in cases of trademark counterfeiting. So we have as many as 18 different government agencies, all of them in one way or another, have responsibility for trademark enforcement. So the typical reaction is that this is a great situation. You have competition, you have a number of different administrative agencies, all of them can provide enforcement. What else could we want? Well, my argument is that this situation, where you have multiple administrative agencies with overlapping enforcement jurisdictions, is actually non-desirable. You have a lot of enforcement, but in the end, this is low-quality enforcement, and enforcement which is likely to encourage the rise of corruption rather than the rule of law. Why is it that I'm going to argue that when you have multiple administrative enforcers with overlapping jurisdictions, you're more likely to have corrupt and non-predictable enforcement? There are two reasons. The first one is decentralization, and the second one is the overlap of the enforcement jurisdictions of those agencies. The majority of the 18 agencies with a trademark enforcement portfolio are decentralized. What this means is that if you have an agency that is operating, let's say, all of you are familiar with Shanghai. So this agency is operating in Shanghai. It has two masters. The first master is the central government of China, which is located in Beijing, and the second master is the Shanghai provincial government. The agency, because it is decentralized, is more likely to side with the interests of the local government than with the interests of the central government. And what we know about China during the reform period is that central and local interests oftentimes diverge. They don't converge. So you have this divergence of central and local interests, and you have administrative agencies that are more likely to side with local governments. In practice, this creates a situation of local protectionism, where the local interests trump central interests. So those agencies, because they're decentralized, are much less likely to actually go ahead and enforce laws and regulations in predictable and consistent ways. So this is the first problem. The first problem is decentralization. And the second problem is the fact that you have all of those agencies, so as many as 18 different agencies, all of them with overlapping jurisdictions. In the US, whenever we see that there's more than one thing, it's always desirable. So it means there's competition. So 3 coffee shops, presumably this leads to better coffee, lower prices, and everybody is happy. Well, this is not necessarily the case in China, because the environment is unregulated, the rules are unclear, not all of those agencies are really providing coffee, so all of them can enforce in case of trademark counterfeiting, but they do it in slightly different ways. It's not really transparent when they should get involved and how. So what this leads to in practice is enforcement which, first of all, is unpredictable. It's haphazard. Oftentimes it is corrupt. You actually have to pay a bribe to those agencies to go out and take your case and enforce against counterfeiters. It is also hard to establish oversight over those agencies. So altogether, this enforcement arrangement is more likely to lead to unpredictable, inconsistent, non-transparent, and unfair enforcement than other kinds of enforcement arrangements. Having multiple agencies leads to difficulty of navigating this legal world. So I'm going to try to convince you that this is correct by presenting a case study of cigarette counterfeiting in China. Cigarettes are the most important source of tax income for the Chinese government. So about 10% of the taxes collected in China come from cigarettes. So in a sense, cigarettes are the golden hen that feeds both the central and the local government. What people are talking about is tobacco finance, for those of you that read Chinese. So they're both centrally collected taxes and locally collected taxes, which are highly desirable. What this has led to is the fact that every single Chinese province is growing tobacco, even though only a small proportion of Chinese provinces actually have the suitable climatic conditions for growing tobacco. The cigarette market in China is hugely segmented. So in most countries you have several cigarette brands that are actually dominating the market. In China, even the biggest brands are capturing less than 10% of the national market. So what happens is each province has its own cigarette brand, and they oftentimes counterfeit the cigarette brand of neighboring provinces. So you have a lot of local governments which are deeply implicated in supporting this counterfeit cigarette industry. In addition to this complicity of local governments, which would lead to a situation of local protectionism, you also have a lot of government agencies which are responsible for enforcing in this area. So here's a partial list of the various agencies in China that have a mandate to enforce in cases of cigarette counterfeiting. And cigarette counterfeiting is a type of trademark counterfeiting because Lucky Strike is a brand name. So if you're not authorized to produce Lucky Strike or Marlboros, and then you just put this logo there, you're violating the relevant trademark laws. So you shouldn't strain your eyes reading those names. The important thing is that there's a lot of agencies and that their mandates are overlapping. So this creates a situation where decentralized enforcers have overlapping mandates, and that creates opportunities for inconsistent and corrupt enforcement. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about just one place in China where we have endemic cigarette counterfeiting. And this place is a county in southern China. So this here is Guangdong province, and I'm going to talk about Yunxiao County in Guangdong province. So this is a county which is located in southern China. Guangdong province is actually a very rich province, but it is a province within which there's a lot of counterfeiting as well. So this is not a place where there is a lack of enforcement activity. So what we have in Yunxiao is literally hundreds of raids that are conducted every year. And how do I know that? I got in touch with private investigators in China, and those are the companies that help individual property right holders to liaise with government agencies. And it's a huge business in China. They charge almost as much as lawyers charge on an hourly basis. And what they can do is they can facilitate the organization of raids. They go ahead and they gather all of the information on the counterfeiters, and then on your behalf, on behalf of Philip Morris or Marlboro, they go ahead and they approach the local government agencies and they say, hey guys, there's some counterfeiting in your city or in your village. We want you to help us and organize a raid. What happens is that oftentimes those agencies are unwilling to do this for free, even though the Chinese law says that all enforcement activity by administrative agencies should be done for free. They say, well, we're busy, so perhaps you can organize a little banquet for us after the raid to just reward us for taking your case, or maybe you can make a little donation. We also perhaps need a new car. Maybe we need a study trip abroad. There are various kinds of things you can try to extract from the individual property right holders and from those private investigators that are working on their behalf. So the private investigators had a neat database about their work in this one county, in Yunxiao County, and they also had spreadsheets that would tell you how much they paid in various kinds of bribes to various government agencies, which government agencies they approached, which government agencies agreed to take their case after how many attempts. So it was an interesting source of data, and not one that is available all that easily. So what did I find about Yunxiao County? So you have hundreds of raids, but those raids are ineffective. So the authorities go ahead and they raid the counterfeiters, and then they take away the counterfeit cigarettes, but they rarely destroy them. Oftentimes, those counterfeits get resold to the original counterfeiters. So this is one unfortunate outcome of those raids. Another thing that happens is that oftentimes you have unsuccessful raids. How could that be? So first of all, you had this private investigative company that has sent somebody who is very highly paid to go ahead and investigate. The person finds out that there is an underground cigarette production factory. They inform the police, and after the police is informed and before it gets to the counterfeiting place, all of the evidence of counterfeiting disappears. Tobacco is gone, the machines are dismantled, and everybody has just disappeared. What this means is that there's somebody at the police who gets in touch with the counterfeiters, and they're warned. The proportion of unsuccessful raids is 24%. So virtually 1 in 4 raids is unsuccessful, even though there's evidence of counterfeiting. So what this means to me is that enforcement, when you have multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and also agencies which are decentralized, is unpredictable. It is oftentimes corrupt, and also it is unfair. And I measure fairness by the ease of appeal. So if you didn't get what you wanted, how easy is it for you to actually appeal this outcome? When it comes to administrative enforcement, appeals rates are extremely low. And as we will see later on, in Chinese courts, there's a much higher rate of appeal, which means that if you feel that you got an unjust outcome, you can go ahead and appeal this decision. There are a couple of graphs here that show you who actually enforces. So you have all of those different agencies that have responsibility for enforcement in case of trademark counterfeiting. The chief enforcement agency is the first one, the Trademark Monopoly Administration, because, the Tobacco Monopoly Administration, because in China, the production and sale of tobacco is a government monopoly. But as you see from this graph, there's a bunch of other entities that are not necessarily chiefly tasked with enforcing in cases of tobacco counterfeiting that get involved in this area. And what I want you to keep in mind is that the enforcement situation for domestic and foreign cigarette brands is radically different in China. So as you see, in cases of foreign brands, the TMA, which is the dominant enforcer for domestic brands, is a relatively insignificant agency. And we have another agency, the TSB, which is a quality control agency that steps in. What this means in practice is that it is highly unpredictable who will take your case, for what kind of a bribe, and what the outcome will be. Will they actually go ahead and destroy the goods, or will they resell those goods to the counterfeiters? If you're unhappy with the decision, will you have the opportunity to appeal and to get another fairer outcome? So the existing enforcement arrangements in China privilege this administrative enforcement. And what we can get is a high level of enforcement, but unfortunately this enforcement is not the most desirable kind of enforcement. Why? Because it is unfair, it is non-transparent, and it is oftentimes inconsistent. So this then is puzzling. What is puzzling is, why is it that in China, where you have multiple options for enforcement, this particular enforcement arrangement became the dominant arrangement? In other words, why is it that civil court enforcement and criminal court enforcement are not the dominant enforcement methods for intellectual property rights? Well, my argument is that the US government has a lot to do with this. The United States and China have been they have engaged in protracted negotiations over intellectual property rights for over 2 decades at this point. Every year, the US government initiates the annual Special 301 process. And what Special 301 is a paragraph in the US Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act. And it allows the United States Trade Representative to impose sanctions on foreign countries which in his or her estimation don't provide sufficient protection for intellectual property rights. So every year the US government goes to China and tells the Chinese, you're not enforcing enough. What we want is, we want to see more administrative enforcement. And the Chinese government gives the US what it wants, more administrative enforcement. So the puzzle is, why hasn't the US government stressed civil and in particular criminal enforcement of intellectual property rights laws? So the reason for that is not that those options are not available in China. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to very briefly tell you about what exists in China in terms of judicial protection of intellectual property rights. So China actually has established specialized intellectual property rights tribunals. There are only 10 countries in the world that have done that. And with the exception of China and Thailand, all of those countries are advanced industrial economies. The United States is one of them, Austria is another one, Germany. So China is, in addition to Thailand, the only developing country that has set aside precious resources to create and staff those specialized intellectual property rights tribunals. They exist at all levels of the Chinese judicial system, at the basic people's court level, which is basically a county-level court in China, at the intermediate court level, at the prefectural level, at the higher court level, which is the equivalent of a provincial court in China, and even the Chinese Supreme People's Court has a specialized chamber which handles intellectual property rights cases. So those courts exist. They have highly trained judges. The judges have taken courses on intellectual property rights law. They have taken courses on English. So those courts exist, and the number of cases that they're handling in any given year is increasing. But the United States has not pressed the Chinese to use them more often. So the courts exist, and they are providing enforcement which is consistent, transparent, and fair. And this is the desirable kind of enforcement. It is also enforcement which is very different from the enforcement provided by administrative agencies. So what do I mean by consistency of adjudication? What this means is that no matter whether your case is decided in Beijing, Shanghai, or Urumqi, Urumqi, for those of you that are not familiar with China, is the capital of Xinjiang, which is an area of China that has a lot of Muslims, and it's relatively underdeveloped. So no matter where your case is adjudicated, you should get the same outcomes if you have the same kind of grievance. For many kinds of cases in China, consistency is hard to come by. So it would vary, the outcome of the case would vary greatly depending on where it's heard. In the area of intellectual property rights law, we actually have consistency of adjudication because the judges are highly trained, and most of those courts are located at the intermediate level of the court system and above, and at those levels we actually have a lot more professionalism. There's also, even though China doesn't have law that is driven by precedent, there's the emergence of precedential opinions by the Supreme People's Court on those matters, and the publication of various legal compendia. So all of those factors taken together help to ensure the consistency of adjudication. The second characteristic of the intellectual property rights courts in China is that adjudication there is transparent. How is it that it's transparent? China has instituted the so-called open trials. And what this means is that anybody can go in and sit on an IPR case in China. When I was in China doing research for my dissertation and then for my book, I went ahead and I tested this feature of the Chinese law. So I was able, just by showing my passport, to get access to courts in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. Admittedly, those are large cities, so this may not be the case in the hinterland provinces in China. But I was able to get access to those courts and to sit in on IPR cases. So when you have open trials, it is much harder for the judge to massage the legal facts and to reach an unfair verdict. The other feature of the IPR courts in China is that the verdicts are published. They're either published on the court's websites, and a great number of IPR courts in China have those websites, or they're published in legal compendia, in various kinds of books that the Shanghai IPR courts or the Beijing IPR courts compile and publish. So those courts operate in transparent ways. The final characteristic of the work of the IPR courts is that they can provide you with a fair trial. And here what I mean by fairness is not that the law itself is fair, but that the procedures specified in the law are followed by the court. So this is procedural fairness. I don't say anything about the intellectual property laws themselves. They may or may not be fair. But procedurally, the courts subscribe to what the law says in terms of holding a trial, holding it according to various principles. How do I measure the fairness of adjudication? My theory is that if you feel that you didn't get a fair trial, you should have the right to appeal. And in the cases where we have administrative agencies that are enforcing laws and regulations, the appeals rates are close to zero, so there are virtually no appeals. So this can mean one of two things. Either that the administrative agencies are doing a great job and everybody is happy with what they're doing, or alternatively, and much more credibly, given that this is China, that administrative agencies are unduly restricting the opportunity of individuals to appeal their decisions. So what we observe in the case of intellectual property rights courts is that the appeals rate is 32%. This is very healthy, and it's 3 times higher than the overall appeal for civil cases in China. What this means is that if individuals feel that they have been unfairly treated by the courts, they can go ahead and they can appeal. And on the second instance case, they can maybe get the fair trial that they want. So the IPR courts in China are providing consistent, transparent, and fair enforcement. This kind of enforcement is typically associated with the rule of law in the West. And yet, the US government hasn't stressed that there should be more civil enforcement in China. So this is puzzling, and in a minute, I'm going to suggest why this is the case and why the US hasn't been pressing for civil enforcement. Before I do that, I want to talk briefly about criminal enforcement in China. So in addition to civil enforcement, you can also go and approach the police and ask them to go ahead and investigate and then handle your grievance. Infringement of intellectual property rights in China is punishable by imprisonment for up to 5 years. In addition to that, there are also steep fines. So the key thing about criminal enforcement is that it has deterrent effect. If this producer of counterfeit Gucci bags knows that he can be punished by imprisonment for up to 5 years, then he's not very likely to go ahead and keep on producing those counterfeits, unless there's a huge profit margin to be made by engaging in that kind of activity. So the Chinese police has an excellent record of imprisoning people, and that's the problem. The problem is that the same police, which can do a great job at putting somebody behind bars in cases of violation of intellectual property rights, is the same police that can be used to suppress human rights organizations in China. It's the same police that was implicated in handling the Falun Gong in the late 1990s. It was not involved in handling the Tiananmen Square protests. Those were handled by the army, but still, the US government tends to see the Chinese police as an organization that is used to quash human rights in China. And my argument is that this may very well be the case. China obviously is not a democracy. Civil and political rights are problematic in China. But what we need to do is we need to differentiate political crimes from economic crimes. The infringement of intellectual property rights is an economic crime. And in cases of economic crimes in China, there are various guarantees in place that the police is actually going to do a good job. And it does a good job. It can put people behind bars, but it doesn't do it in a frivolous way. So criminal enforcement options exist in China, but they have not been stressed by the US government. So before I move on to a brief discussion of the Russian case and how that is different from the Chinese case, I want to say a few words about the IPR enforcement situation in China in general. So the US government has a lot of clout with China. It can use the Special 301 process to force the Chinese to provide certain kinds of enforcement. In addition to the US government, there are also various associations that exist in China of trademark owners, patent owners, copyright owners that also have a lot of clout with the Chinese government. So this combined pressure of associations working in China, representing foreign interests and also Chinese interests, in addition to the US government, can actually have a very strong effect on what the Chinese government does. Unfortunately, the pressure that has been put on the Chinese government has stressed administrative enforcement. And this kind of enforcement is ineffective because essentially it is non-transparent, it is unfair, it's inconsistent. All of those things don't go along with the emergence of predictable and fair enforcement, which we typically associate with the rule of law in the West. So the puzzle is, why is it that the US hasn't stressed civil and criminal enforcement? The criminal enforcement answer is simple. There's still this residual notion that the Chinese police is evil, and that because they suppress human rights, they are also they should not be used to fight economic crime. That there are no protections in the handling of criminal IPR cases in China. That enforcement in those situations is arbitrary, that people get thrown behind bars, that they get executed for violation of intellectual property rights laws, and so on and so forth. This view is outdated, and what actually we have been observing in the last 2 years is that the strategy of the US government towards China has changed. And the new policy of the US government is to actually say, in addition to everything else you're doing, you should also provide criminal enforcement. But until very recently, the strategy has been to stress administrative enforcement. So the avoidance of criminal enforcement was a reaction to this unfortunate notion that conflated political and economic crimes in China. What about the avoidance of civil enforcement? So those IPR courts that exist in China, which are providing this consistent, transparent, and fair enforcement, why is it that the US government hasn't stressed that they should be used? Well, because right holders want quick enforcement. They want the problem to be handled now, and they want a result today, or if not today, tomorrow. And what the administrative agencies can do is, you can go in the morning, they can go in the afternoon and raid the counterfeiter, and by the evening you feel that the job has been done. However, once they raid the counterfeiter, they then resell the counterfeit items to him or her, so this enforcement is ineffective. So the US government has been very impatient. It has felt that Chinese court cases take forever. On average, they take 6 months, which is a lot faster than the same category of cases in the US or in France or in the Czech Republic. So Chinese courts are actually pretty fast and they're quite efficient. But because of lack of knowledge and because of impatience on the part of right holders, the US government, which is very reactive actually to the demands of those right holders, has been stressing the wrong kind of enforcement. So this is the situation in China. There's a lot of enforcement, but not of the right kind. Now, to contrast this with the case in Russia. So remember from the beginning of this talk, China and Russia are very similar. They're huge countries. They were both communist. They're relatively not quite poor, but they're at middle levels of development. They're not particularly rich. And they have high piracy rates. The approach that the US government has taken towards those two countries, however, is radically different. So on the one hand, we have China, where the US government has been stressing for close to 2 decades you should enforce more. It has been basically banging the Chinese on the head, enforce, enforce, enforce. In the case of Russia, it hasn't done that. Why? The reasons are political. In the 1990s, Russia had a president by the name of Boris Yeltsin, who was a friend of the West. He was a Democrat, and it was not expedient to pressure him about something that is relatively minor, such as intellectual property rights. So we're talking of a couple of $2 billion a year that are lost by the U.S. Copyright and trademark industry in China. The fight for democracy was a much bigger prize to be won by Yeltsin and the West. Now, in retrospect, we know that Yeltsin was not the nicest person. He was corrupt. He was a crook. He won re-election in 1996 when his popularity rating was 5% plus or minus 4. That was the error term. And he won re-election with significant, it's opinion polls, 5% plus or minus 4. So we don't quite know where it was. But his opponent, Gennady Zyuganov, the communist, was a lot more popular. And then there was a massive infusion of Western cash as well as domestic money that helped engineer his re-election campaign. He actually had a heart attack after the first round of the elections, and he won while he was in hospital. This was kept secret from the public. Old tapes of him were released saying he's alive and well and vigorous. Please re-elect him. And then with some padding of the ballot boxes, he managed to stay in power. So in the 1990s, it was not politically expedient to pressure Russia to enforce intellectual property rights because it was headed on this glorious road towards democracy. Then Putin came along, and he had a very different vision of Russia's future. The West decided quickly that he is an authoritarian, that he's an autocrat, and then it was possible to pressure Russia to enforce intellectual property rights laws. So what is the situation like in Russia? Unlike China, it has very few administrative agencies that can provide administrative enforcement of intellectual property rights. So most of the action in the case of Russia is between civil courts and criminal enforcement of laws and of IPR laws and regulations. So administrative enforcement has been negligible in Russia. Civil courts were very rarely used. We're talking here of the commercial courts, the arbitrage courts. And criminal enforcement has also historically been unimportant. Now, everything changed once Putin came to power and once Russia decided seriously that it wanted to enter the World Trade Organization. Now, the World Trade Organization has an agreement called the TRIPS Agreement, which is the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And all countries, before they accede to the World Trade Organization, have to harmonize their domestic IPR legislation with this agreement. So this process of accession to the World Trade Organization gives the United States and other countries an opportunity to pressure countries that are aspiring to entry in this important trade club. So the US and other countries can pressure them to provide more enforcement of intellectual property rights laws. So what we have been observing in Russia is that after Putin's accession to power, and particularly after 2000, 2001, 2002, there has been a very interesting trend in the data. And this trend is basically a huge jump in the number of copyright crimes registered by the Chinese police. So in Russia, the infringement of copyright is punishable by imprisonment for up to 5 years. Early in this year, the law was amended, and the maximum imprisonment is up to 6 years. So even though copyright violations were punishable with imprisonment for up to 5 years before 2000, as you can see on this graph, and maybe you can't quite see, but I'm not sure where I should stand with this mic. So before 2000, the number of copyright cases was negligible. And then after about 2002, 2003, they started to grow. The largest increase occurred in 2006, and we have another increase in 2007. So those are really the years when the U.S. pressured very strongly Russia to provide more enforcement of copyrights. So the Russian government reacted to this pressure, and it started to use the police to provide this enforcement. Now, there are problems with criminal enforcement. Most of it occurs in Moscow and St. Petersburg and Kazan. So about 75% of the cases are concentrated essentially in 3 cities. Enforcement is not always predictable. There's some corruption within the police. There are certain factories that never get closed. But my argument is that when you have this predominance of criminal enforcement, this is actually the most desirable kind of enforcement for intellectual property rights. Why? Because there's this deterrent effect. When you threaten people with putting them behind bars, they're actually likely to listen. And second, because you actually have very clear rules as to who should enforce. You don't have those 18 different agencies, all of them with overlapping jurisdictions that don't quite know what they're doing. In addition to that, you have an enforcer who is centralized. So the Russian police is a centralized government agency, which is in marked contrast to the administrative enforcement agencies that exist in China, which are decentralized and also they have overlapping jurisdictions. So even though there are problems with this criminal enforcement, it is the desirable kind of enforcement, and we see in in Russia, that there is a significant increase in recent years. Court cases, unfortunately, the lower line on this graph, have not increased to the same degree. There's some positive trends there, but court enforcement through the arbitrage courts is still an afterthought in Russia. However, this situation where essentially you have 2 enforcers, criminal courts and civil courts, is much more desirable than the confusing situation in China with the multiple administrative enforcers that are enforcing in inconsistent, non-transparent, and unpredictable ways. So to sum up, there are 4 different ways to enforce intellectual property rights laws. I didn't talk about one of them, which is this customs enforcement, because it's a little bit idiosyncratic. If you have questions about it, I can talk about it in the Q&A. So essentially, there are 3 others: administrative enforcement on the one hand, and then civil and criminal enforcement on the other. The argument has been that administrative enforcement can breed corruption. And it is not conducive to the emergence of secure property rights and the rule of law. So this is not something that is particularly desirable. Nevertheless, this kind of enforcement has emerged as the dominant kind of enforcement in China. Why? Because the US government has stressed it. Why has the US government stressed this particular kind of enforcement? It has distrusted the Chinese criminal justice system, and it has felt that the Chinese civil court system is slow, inefficient, and it is unable to provide this essentially quick and dirty enforcement that you can get through the administrative agencies. So what we're observing in recent years is that the negotiating strategy of the US government, as well as the negotiating priorities of various right holder associations that exist in China, has changed. And both the US government and those associations of trademark or copyright holders have started to stress criminal enforcement. They're not really stressing as much civil court enforcement, but they're also waking up to the possibility that the civil courts may actually provide desirable enforcement. So in terms of recommendations for US foreign policy, the recommendation is clear. Obviously, the stress of administrative enforcement is misguided. Criminal and civil enforcement have to be stressed as well. In terms of factors that are conducive to the emergence of the rule of law, administrative enforcement in China, because it is unpredictable, is not conducive to the emergence of the rule of law. And in Russia, the situation is, in a sense, better than the situation in China. There's a lot less enforcement to be had, but the enforcement that exists is provided by the Russian police. We don't have very much administrative enforcement. And police enforcement is superior to administrative enforcement when it comes to protecting property rights and promoting the rule of law. So I will stop here, and I don't quite know how much time we have for questions, but
we have time for several questions.
Great. So I look forward to questions. Yes.
One detailed question. You say in Russia it is centered, this process, in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan?
Yeah.
And why Kazan? It's a Muslim area.
Yes. So for those of you that, I should have had a map of Russia, but I don't. For those of you that are not familiar with the geography of Russia, Kazan is the capital of Tatarstan, and Tatarstan is a republic within the Russian Federation. So it's a very important territorial unit. It's a Muslim area, you're right. It's also an area in which we have a lot of factories that are producing counterfeit CDs, DVDs, and computer software programs. So there's actually a lot of need in this area for enforcement. It is also an area that is ruled by essentially an autocrat who for a number of years was able to evade central regulations. So after the centralization of the police around 2000, there was actually a lot of need to enforce there. So enforcement is occurring in the areas where we would expect to see it, in the major commercial centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also in the city of Kazan, which is a center of counterfeiting.
Is the U.S. the only country that are actually... Is the U.S. the only country that are pressuring countries like Russia as far as with the enforcement rate? Like, are there any other countries besides the U.S. that are heavily... Because I'd figure that if a lot of these products are produced fake, so-called, a lot of its manufacturers are also located in Europe as well, besides U.S. So...
Yeah, this is a great question. When I was doing my dissertation research, which I began in about 2000, Europe wasn't really an important factor in China. The reason for that is that the EU didn't have a coherent position on piracy and counterfeiting. All of that has changed. So right now, as we speak, the EU Trade Commissioner, Peter Mandelson, is in Beijing pressuring the Chinese to provide more enforcement of intellectual property rights. So these days, they are being pressured both by the US and by the EU. And actually, I haven't done much research on exactly what the EU is stressing in terms of enforcement strategy. My sense is that they are stressing criminal enforcement, which is the right thing to stress. But I haven't really interviewed much with EU officials, and I haven't looked at as many documents on negotiation strategy as I have for the US. But even though they woke up to the need to pressure the Chinese relatively late, they seem to be doing the right thing, stressing criminal enforcement. Professor Essere.
Sure. You treat great talk, by the way. You treat enforcement as if administrative, civil, and criminal, and maybe even customs types of enforcement are mutually exclusive. Are there ways in which different types of enforcement can go forward together? Can you sort of guide us through an explanation of which route enforcement takes, perhaps in certain instances? And I just wanted to push you a little bit about this, the preference in China toward administrative enforcement. You give a lot of credit to the U.S. government, and I guess I wish the U.S. government was as powerful as you suggest it may be, but my thinking is that administrative agencies prefer administrative enforcement because they profit through corruption, and unless you can combat that, you have a really hard time making the case that the U.S. is more powerful than, in fact, the domestic Chinese political interests.
Yeah, so great questions. On the second part, you're absolutely correct. So it's not only the U.S. government, it's the Chinese government agencies at the local level that are interested in perpetuating this inefficient type of enforcement. However, when the US government is pressuring the Chinese government and it tells the central government, we want to see more administrative enforcement, this is perfect because the local government agencies in China want to see exactly that. So you have an unfortunate overlap of interests in this particular case. And the US government position doesn't help in any way to get to the right kind of enforcement. Now, on your first question about different types of enforcement, so are they mutually exclusive? Not really. I mean, there are cases when you can go for administrative enforcement. If it fails, you can get to the courts. And to really answer your question, I need more time than I have. So for some subtypes of intellectual property rights, such as patents, we actually observe that the courts are much more active players. And there, we don't have 18 government agencies, we just have one. So when you have one agency and the courts, over time, the courts are emerging as more active players. When you have 18, it's very rare for individuals to actually reach the courts because somewhere along the line, one of those 18 is going to take your case with or without a bribe. They will do a great job, very rarely, typically not such a great job. But you're very unlikely to go to court. The ratio of court cases to administrative cases in cases of trademark counterfeiting in China is 1 to 900. So you actually have a huge predominance of administrative enforcement in the case of trademarks. In patents, courts have actually begun to dominate enforcement. So we have a 2-to-1 ratio between courts and administrative agencies in patents. In copyrights, it's in between. So it's a great question. Administrative agencies and courts can sometimes function as complementary enforcers, but typically they don't, especially in trademarks. So here I'm presenting the most radical scenario in order to make my point that administrative enforcement is evil. Yes?
Yes, thank you as well for a very informative talk. And I'm really fascinated by the efficiency of the Chinese courts to be able to process a case in 6 months. I think that would be fascinating to go into, but what I'd like to ask you about is something related to the previous question, which I could characterize or start with by saying no buyer, no seller. If nobody's around to buy the counterfeited goods or the violations of copyrighted goods and so forth, they won't be produced. And what I've encountered in working in other places is that there is a culture of that doesn't see copyright or intellectual property the same way we would. That it's really universal goods. It's owned by everybody or by nobody, more precisely. And could you comment on, or I at least have encountered that. Could you comment on the relationship between that cultural attitude and those beliefs that go into that and the circumstances in both China and Russia with respect to enforcement and development of intellectual property?
This is a great question, and it allows me to talk very briefly about how I got the idea for this project. So it all started with a book review that I read. I was in my second year in grad school, and I was just looking for something to write a term paper on. And I read this review of a great book with a great title. The book is called "To Steal a Book is an Elegant Offense." And it's written by Bill Alford, who is the Vice Dean of Harvard Law School and arguably the premier Chinese law expert in the country. What this book argued is that there are cultural reasons for piracy in China, and that the Chinese have always learned by copying the work of others. This is a basic Confucian value. You learn by copying the work of great masters. So because China has this Confucian culture, China will never ever be able to embrace contemporary Western notions of copyright, because this piracy, this copying, is essentially ingrained in the Chinese psyche. So this is the Alford thesis, and I felt that there was something off there. I mean, it just couldn't be. I mean, you know, it's like this cultural thing. Yes, of course, culture is very important, but, you know, how could it be that, you know, because of those Confucian values, they're never ever going to protect intellectual property rights? And the other thing was, you know, the pirates themselves, the reason that they're doing that is not because they're learning from the work of great masters. They're doing it because they want to make a quick buck. And individual Chinese citizens are buying counterfeit copies of software, not because they're learning from the great Microsoft, but because the counterfeit is $2 and the real thing is 300. So somehow it didn't make much sense. And I went ahead, and first I went to Taiwan, which arguably is also a Confucian country, but it has been able to slash its piracy rate from 90% in the late 1970s to about 42% by the mid-1990s. And I was wondering, you know, what's going on there? And there the story was about U.S. pressure. So U.S. pressure seems to have a lot of effect on countries with cultures which are inimical to the protection of intellectual property rights, if we believe in this cultural argument. The other thing which is very interesting about China is the domestic development of copyrights. So if we look at copyright cases handled by Chinese courts, what would be your guess as to the proportion of cases that involve one Chinese citizen suing another Chinese citizen? Anybody? What would you guess it would be? You seem to have an idea. No?
Over half.
Right. It's 90. Yeah, so 90% of the cases handled by Chinese intellectual property rights courts are one Chinese citizen suing another Chinese citizen. So for me, that's the best argument against Alford's thesis. So cultural reasons, obviously, you know, there are such things as, you know, cultural values that are inimical to copyright protection and to intellectual property rights, but the Chinese themselves have realized that this is property and that there's money to be made by protecting your property. There's also money to be made by infringing the property of others. So for me, it's not a cultural argument. You know, perhaps, you know, I mean, not to imply that Alford is absolutely wrong, you know, it could be that those cultural values make it harder to establish those norms, and that in Western cultures, you know, Western Europe, where you don't have this value of learning by copying the work of others, progress is faster. But, you know, what we're observing is that there are countries that don't have any of those cultural values where, you know, piracy is pretty high. So in the end, for me, it's mostly about economic incentives and about the severity of enforcement. And when we talk about severity of enforcement, then criminal enforcement is really the way to go, particularly when it's a new norm, a new law, and you want to impress upon people that it's important to respect it.
Hello.
Yes. Hi, Sammy.
Hey. In one of your examples about administrative enforcement was the raids that are target the places which produce these counterfeit products. Does administrative enforcement or any other kind of enforcement also target the mediators? How about the guy who's selling the counterfeit products on the street? Or do they never get targeted? He's also trying to make a buck by, you know, yeah.
So Semih-Can has read, well, at least a large portion of my book, because he was my student this summer at Dartmouth. So thank you for coming to this talk. And he has suffered through at least one lecture on intellectual property rights in China, now came to hear it again. So who gets targeted in those raids? Well, there's several groups of individuals. So the individual distributors on the street, they get targeted the most. So the kinds of raids I'm describing in Yunxiao County, where you're trying to target the owner of a factory, are relatively rare. So we could also say that, you know, whatever administrative effort exists is somewhat misplaced, because you really have to target the owners of the factories, not the individuals that are selling on the streets, because, you know, for them it's a living, right? It's a salary. And for the owners of factories, there are huge profits to be made. The individuals selling on the street are not making that much money. And this is where most of the enforcement activity is targeted. And then once the goods are seized, they tend to be resold. So a lot of effort is wasted.
Hi, I was wondering why U.S. doesn't enforce customs enforcement they don't stress customs enforcement in China, because it directly affects America, and I know that they're pretty good at it. So why don't they enforce it in China before it ends up coming over here, and what are they getting out of that?
It's oversight. This has all changed. So as of a year and a half ago, the U.S. has started to pressure China to provide more customs enforcement. I didn't talk about customs enforcement, but the numbers are up. So the Chinese are doing more, but effectively what the U.S. is telling China is make sure that counterfeits are not leaving your country. And China is saying, no country does that. Every country is interested in preventing counterfeits from entering the country. And the Chinese government produces all of those reports saying, look, we produce counterfeits, but we're also flooded by counterfeits. There's a lot of counterfeits that are coming from Indonesia, they're coming from Taiwan, Malaysia, everywhere. And they come to China. And we protect ourselves from those counterfeits that are being imported into China. It's not our responsibility to protect you. You mean you have your own customs, so you could employ them, and they seize a lot of Chinese counterfeits. So this has been the traditional response in the last year or so. It has changed after all of those product quality scandals. That poisonous toothpaste and the toys that are unsafe for children. In those cases, you have both product quality problems and problems typically with counterfeiting of trademarks. So because of this unfortunate interaction of two sets of laws, and because of the fact that American consumers are so unhappy, the U.S. government has begun to stress customs enforcement as well. So essentially, over the last year, the U.S. government is doing the right things. But historically, for about 2 decades, it hasn't been.
Any more questions? One more? We have time for one more. Yeah.
Yes, on that last point about the bad goods coming from China and getting into the United States market, some people believe that one of the best ways to police that is to require the companies that are contracting with Chinese firms or have their own production facilities in China to make sure they police that on site. What has happened in the past is that American companies like Nike have said, here are the requirements for production. You can't have slave labor, you can't have this, you can't have, and so forth. And they've audited that periodically, but the audits have actually been falsified. And so now the pressure is to say, you've got to actually check each batch of goods. You've got to be able to somehow certify yourself, you Walmart or you Nike, that these are legitimate goods, they're not poisoned, et cetera, et cetera. Can you comment on that as a potential means for enforcing intellectual property rights?
I mean, I think it would be a great thing. And the implication of what you're saying is that China is not the only one that is to blame here, that a lot of the blame resides with American companies that are interested in large profit margins and that are not doing their homework. So I'm all for it, that American companies operating in China, European companies operating in China, have to make sure that those quality standards are met and that all of the rules and regulations are abided by. Absolutely. And China is doing a lot. Unfortunately, a large chunk of that effort is misplaced. The other thing that can be done, in addition to those foreign companies policing themselves, is pressure which is targeted the right way, and pressuring China to do the right kinds of things, and then everybody will benefit.
All righty. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.